but the mission remains largely exactly what it was prior. I would, and I'm sure we'll get to this conversation, but every new phase of the pandemic / endemic, depending on one's point of view, ignites a different kind of element of discussion between employees and employers that has a lot of my peers, CHROs, just fundamentally revisiting the relationship and how they can both retain and attract employees in the midst of, what is arguably the most turbulence that the labor force has seen since the Great Depression.
Usually we'll introduce it first, but I think I like that introduction, the way you said it. So maybe we'll keep that in, but then now officially introduce Steve Pemberton from Workhuman, Chief, what's the exact title that you had? Chief People Officer?
Chief Human Resources Officer.
Now, what's the difference between Chief Human Resource Officer or Chief People? Because
there
that seems to be
okay.
No,
Chief People seems to be the thing now, right? Or no?
No, and there's always a thing in HR, by the way, about rebranding. The term human resources is kind of fascinating. If you went back to the 1890s and just kind of stepped through the business world, there's very few items, nomenclatures that you would see still with us. Human resources would not be one of them. The term was coined in the 1890s. That's how long it's been around, and it's still with us. So it always goes through these attempts to kind of rebrand itself. Chief People Officer, I'm not sure how sustainable it is because human resources is still with us.
Hey, Mike, I think you have a question that you wanted to ask.
Oh, sure, Steve, it's good to have you on the show. And I'm curious, what have you learned with COVID and how your company has changed? Like, what sort of insights have you gotten that perhaps we haven't been reading in the mainstream media? Any insights that you've seen from your perspective?
A great question, Michael. The word fragile comes to mind, and tenuous. What I'm getting at specifically is the relationship between employee and employer, between executive teams and individual contributors, and how those processes are all being fundamentally revisited. The way in which work is done, when you have multiple generations, 4 now in the workforce, you could argue, having come in at different times, executive teams, management teams, they're by and large accustomed to measuring success. How many cars are in the parking lot after past 5 o'clock? How early are people getting in? That's all changed, because since March of 2020, employees have said, no longer is there a question about whether or not I can do my job remotely. No longer should you be wondering whether or not I can work in a hybrid way and still be productive. We've answered those questions. So now, as we go through these different phases of, potentially emerging, that relationship now has to be reestablished. Employers, much to their chagrin, and executive teams in particular, I will point out, we're not in the driver's seat. We're not. Employees are. And they are dictating the way in which they're going to work. And that should not be a source of angst for leaders, in part because this whole work and life relationship has been revisited. Humans have now been able to, you're there for bedtime stories. I'm here to help my daughter with homework. For example, you can walk the dog. Just life, right? But you're also dealing with the pressures, the sandwich generation, raising young children, taking care of aging parents, and the expectation that their employer is going to be cognizant of that stress and reflect that in the ways in which they're willing to accommodate, rather than being dragged back to hour-long commutes. and, no flexibility in terms of, hey, I want to drop my daughter off, see her off on the school bus a couple of mornings, right? Those kinds of things are what's made it, tenuous. And that's just my first reaction. I mean, there's a whole series of other things I think that are unfolding and will continue to.
Tessa?
Yeah, so Steve, I had a question, kind of going back a little bit to, kind of when your company found the need in the marketplace for employers to really start to understand that money is not necessarily the only driver for commitment to a company or loyalty, but that gratitude plays a pretty large role in the happiness of an employee at work. So can you talk a little bit about at what point do employers come to you to say, we need to do something else? We need to meet a greater need that our employees have to feel loyal to our company. And, what's that opening that you have in working with employers to say, we can provide that gratitude piece, that mechanism to make your employees feel appreciated?
There's a number of factors that will drive that initial inquiry. Retention challenges is oftentimes one of them. We are losing people at a record number, and we want to stop that. And as we conduct exit interviews, for example, company A says, we realize that we really do have a retention challenge here, and it is sourced and driven by a lack of appreciation and gratitude that people feel for the jobs that they do. It's that age-old adage that people quit people long before they quit the company. That your working relationships with peers, with managers, have as much to do with your loyalty to a company as your compensation level does. And I think, again, the pandemic has accelerated all of that. Culture, specifically. I can think of one, company that will go nameless that came to us several years ago and it was very candid and said, we have a toxic culture. Currency at this company is derived by who you can attack, diminish. And it's been that way for so long that people don't know how else to behave. And so we need to set we have to create a lighthouse for them. And I think that comes from getting the values and the words off the wall and into behaviors. And recognition and gratitude is the way to do that. So for example, at Workhuman, one of our values is urgency. But if we do not define that for you by what we mean in terms of urgency, it could look really, really different. And so I could call Laura in a real huff about something because I need this immediately, and I could not be particularly respectful to her. And I could justify that by saying, this is an urgent need I have, Laura, so sorry you didn't like my tone, but I got to get it done.
That sounds very familiar, Steve. we just went through that here. Literally, yeah. So how, it would be good if you could say, how do you manage that? For somebody who may be someone like me, how do you handle that in the future to do it more, definitely?
So yes, so you're not changing the value because the value is a value. That's urgency, respect for all, and we just keep going. But what you're doing in a moment, in a recognition moment, is you're defining what urgent looks like. So we'll take that same story with me and Laura, and I have come to her with an urgent request. She works in marketing. I've got to get this campaign. I got to launch it in Q1. Really need your help. And Laura pauses what she's doing and helps me. Well, then what I do is I send her a recognition moment and I say, Laura, I know I came at you last minute on something that was urgent and that I needed. And I really do appreciate you pausing your other projects to assist this need. And here is how that turned out. Now, in an ecosystem of gratitude, she and I are peers, I should point out. So I'm not waiting, she's not waiting for you, Jack. to say, okay, well, I recognize Laura for that urgency, because you might not know that I've called on her in that way. But in the feed that is recognition, you see this interaction happening between the two of us. And so now you see, wow, Laura didn't talk to me about that in her one-to-one, but I can see she really helped Steve in that moment. And that becomes part of your assessment and understanding of how she's responding to an urgent need. Now you multiply that over multiple values, and as a consistent pattern, and leaders begin to understand what is affirmed, what is celebrated, and what is not. And you can see how recognition begins to make those, those cultural, shifts that, as the age-old adage goes, does indeed eat strategy for lunch. And that value, and I always will emphasize, getting the values off the wall and into a common understanding, and doing that by affirming the kinds of behaviors that you want to see and celebrating, recognizing those.
Yeah, it's the how, right? The how people are doing that. So the behavioralizing of it, right? That you're reinforcing. That is so cool, Steve. So I was in this position a while back, but I think there's a unique challenge for companies that are focused on creating great places to work as a product, right? So that's the focus, and that makes the bar so high internally, right? I mean, even the name of your company creates this expectation or bar that for your own employees, you got to be doing that, right? And I just was curious about any kind of challenges or lessons learned that you've had along the way around trying to meet this pretty high bar.
I've always been fascinated by the general rankings along a whole series of measures. Great places to work, top companies for working mothers, top companies for corporate social responsibility. And my pause about them, although I do understand their value, there's best practices, methodologies that you take, all that's helpful. However, if one's not careful, it creates a culture of arrival. So, once I'm on the list, I'm a great company to work, so our work is done. And that's perilous. And so we felt and do feel so strongly about that at Workhuman, and specifically what human resources role is, that about a year and a half ago, we changed the name from human resources at the company to human experiences, because that is what we're creating for our employees. So out externally, I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer, but internally we refer to HR as HX, and I'm the Chief Human Experiences Officer. And I think it's just one of the things that we've learned, is that it's our responsibility to create experiences that excite people, that is connected to their sense of mission and our sense of mission, of course, and how they can realize their own personal journeys at the company. The pandemic, I should point out, has only accelerated all of that, because it is this extension now of community. We lost community, we lost connection to one another, and we still are battling this. So it's no accident that you're seeing, quote unquote, the great resignation, or the great talent swap, or the great quit, however it gets branded. It's no accident that that's happening at a time when people are fundamentally asking, what's the relationship between employer and employee? And I should also point out too, matters of social unrest, and what is the organizational responsibility to addressing those things. As near as I can tell, I think it's because the workplace might be humanity's last best place to connect.
Yes.
Last best place to see some sense of humanity, some sense of goodness, some affirming, some belief that despite it all, polarization and dissonance and carping, that there is still some goodness in us after all. And that we want to know that there are places that we can find that, and that we can come together towards a common good. And when you struggle to see that in the broader world, and I would argue that we are struggling to see that in the broader world, it doesn't mean we stop looking for it as human beings. It's just we have to now look in different places. And where are people looking? They're looking to the places that they work. Yep. And if they don't find it, they're exiting, in essence. And it's a fascinating dynamic.
It is, and the bar is so high, right? I mean, there's a lot, that's a
Yes.
lot of expectation on everybody who works in an organization, but especially I feel like leaders at this point, right? To be able to meet that expectation, it's tough.
You have to build new muscle, Laura.
Yes.
You have to build new muscle. Yeah.
Steve, I want to ask a follow-up to that because a lot of my research is actually looking at brand values and kind of the intersection between a company and the way that they treat their employees, and then also the values that they espouse to their customers. So I think you bring up a really great point as far as these companies are asking to respond to a lot of these social issues, especially around social justice that we saw in the past 2 summers with the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter. And what ended up we found out were that a lot of companies were woke washing, right? So they would hashtag BLM, but they didn't actually represent or authentically operationalize those values within their organization. So what's your advice to those companies who have pressure on their brands to respond, but haven't done the work internally within their organization on the HR front?
You're dealing with a savvier, workforce, and who's cognizant of the distinction between statements of support and actions and behaviors. Statements in and of themselves are no longer sufficient. And I would argue that prior to Black Lives Matter, the same thing was true relative to the Me Too movement as well. And it is the expectation that employers are going to do a little bit more than issue a statement. And in quite a few cases, when companies have failed to do that, the employees have really railed against the leadership. In a couple of instances have actually unionized, but not unionized in the way that we have come to think of unionization. Unionizing to make sure that you are focused on the greater good. If you look at the workforce that we are trying to attract, these are the things that matter to them. Those are mutable demographics of any workforce. So yes, one's social consciousness, where you stand on climate change, whether or not you are an ethical supplier, they are coming to us already with those expectations. Do you have employee resource groups along those lines? What are your policies for new moms returning to the workplace? This is already, part of how they're approaching this. And if you don't have clear, concise answers and approaches, I can assure you that your competition does. And when you're dealing with some very competitive sectors, technology, as an example, you will get outflanked by your competition very quickly because they are making and taking very clear positions and investments accordingly. I will say, particularly post George Floyd, that a number of companies, though, have kind of recalibrated their mission to realize that there's just not the fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, but there is a broader societal responsibility. The Business Roundtable modified their mission as an example. And in some ways, it's an acknowledgement that we have a responsibility here. It's kind of the antithesis of, Friedman's school of thought. We have no societal responsibility as a company other than generate a profit. I don't think that's true anymore. And it's because the people who we're trying to attract are expecting this. And what happens if you don't provide that? Well, we talked about it earlier. They are exiting. And we're seeing every day in the retail sector, in the manufacturing sector, they're dealing with staff shortages, certainly in the healthcare sector, right? They're dealing with staff shortages, and the reasons why they isn't just about paying them. It's not about paying people simply. That in and of itself is not enough. And then lastly, I would say the greater responsibility that organizations have to promote some healing in society. In all candor, if we cannot find it in our politics, and it appears that we cannot, at least in this current time frame, and it appears that we have modes of communication vis-a-vis social media that set us in opposition to each other purposefully, where it becomes a business model. There's a cost to doing that, and there's also a reaction to that. And so where am I again going to find places where I don't have to live in that world of dissonance and clashing and It's sitting on a project team, than thinking about how we're going to take on a new marketing campaign, for example. Like, we want to be excited and thrilled and not in this other world.
I'd like to double click on the statement you made about outflanking competition, which I think is really interesting. And with your service and all the changes that we've had in the last couple of years, are there any changes that you've done to make sure that the remote workers aren't being overlooked, like we're recognizing them? And is there also any differentiation between people's personality types, such as extroversion versus introversion, and how you're recognizing them?
I'll begin with the first, the first question. And when you really double click on this, in terms of culture and getting the cadence right, we've largely been forced into a remote way of working, but you have to work differently because of the other thing that is not being talked about as much. And it is the home alone effect, as I've come to call it. Kevin McAllister gets stranded at home, and for the first couple of days, it's a lot of fun, right? And it's all good, but then after a while, begin to settle in the isolation, and this is where we have been for quite some time. I see that in our world, where people are exhausted, they're drained, they're on screens all day. They're helping their son or daughter with homework because school's been suspended because of a positive COVID test. I mean, a lot is on people. So trying to create meetings that aren't about the meeting, right? And just, how are you doing? What did you get for Christmas? What is the most meaningful thing that's happened to you? You have to be so much more considered about those interactions that often happened in the hall. So I'd be walking down the hall and, hey, Mike, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, I went to a Red Sox game, and and that's just it's a quick passing conversation, but there's that interaction. And when we're getting on a screen, and okay, so here's the agenda and here's what we're talking through, and work becomes transactional then. So I think you have to be much more purposeful about the human interactions, specifically, because that does matter a great deal to people. And then I think in terms of how we're continuing to connect and have conversations about the human experience. One of the things that we have taken to is just a renewed focus on parents. That's the nature of our workforce. We are predominantly made up of millennials who are parents to young children. And so to be focused on that need that they have. You looked at our Slack channels, parent Slack channel, and man, the questions that come through there about how are you handling school and homework and all those things. Employees' experiences becoming resources to one another is so incredibly valuable and so incredibly important. And I would argue it's the employer's responsibility to foster that. And lastly, I would say to recognize the isolation that people are experiencing. Wherever we are 10 years from now relative to the pandemic, one of the markers, one of the halo effects of the pandemic is going to be a renewed focus on mental health and wellness by employers. It is going to be a renewed focus. I mean, I think it already is. It's going to level up to an active discipline.
I completely agree with you. And in a different way. I mean, I think what's been amazing is the support for people to get mental health support, right? To go, yeah, you should do that. Or I see a therapist, you should go see a therapist. But to me, I think it's like the upstream part of that. Like, what role does work play in exacerbating mental health issues and mental health struggles? And how can we start getting into that, right? To me, that's where the evolution really needs to happen. I think there's so much to that. And I don't know if managers and leaders are ready for that, right? We don't have a lot of language for some of the things we need to have a language about around things like you were talking about, healing and recovery. And so anyway, I'm all with you on that. I was
We
wondering
better
if
get there, Laura. We better find that language very quickly.
there's some work, right? I'm actually doing a study right now with therapists around what they've learned from people who are working, so we can feed that back, to organizations. So, yeah,
Yes.
kind of interesting. Steve, I'm so fascinated. I'm always fascinated about people's stories and their career stories. I wonder if you could share with us, how did you get here, and what's kind of your background? I think it's just fascinating to hear about that.
Yeah, I should say that it's a book, and quite literally, it is a book. I some years ago was asked by my then 6-year-old son if, when I was a little boy, did I have a daddy, and I told him no. And he said, well, what about a mommy? And again, I tell him no. And my naivete as a young dad, I didn't realize that was not going to be the end of the conversation. And so I wound up writing a book about growing up in Massachusetts in foster care. Very turbulent, very dark, very difficult situation. Managed to get to college, Boston College specifically. And day after I graduated, I was alone. And it struck me for the first time as odd that I didn't have family. I've been so accustomed to life without it that I didn't think it was odd until I saw all these families gathered and, in essence, went looking for my origin story and found it. And so wound up writing the story about it. Thought it was for my children. It becomes a bestseller in a movie, none of which I was trying to do, to be candid. I was just trying to leave a legacy to them so they would understand, as everybody should understand, your origin story. Boy, that teach me quite a few things. One, that we all have a story and we don't look like that story. And the markers that so often define us in our society, our politics, our race, our gender, our religion, that is a part of our story, but it is not the entirety of our story. If there's one big societal miss we have, is that we don't see that.
Yes.
And the deeper, and I will confess too, by the way, that I didn't learn that myself until after this wave of reaction and response to my story came. I think it's true for any of us. You share your story, and what it really is an invitation for others to share their stories with you. And when you do that, you see these common threads of humanity that connect us. And I think that often happens in the context of careers. In my 20s, I was a college admissions officer. In my 30s, I went through an entrepreneurial stage, I guess you might say, that brought me to Monster.com, to Walgreens. I got into human resources in part because I'm always fascinated by this intersection of individual stories and the systems and structures that support them. I mean, it's just a fascinating duality to me that emerge in so many different fields of study. In sociology, is agency versus structure. In psychology, it is nature versus nurture. Which of those things dominate? It's always fascinating to me, and I think human resources is a place where that plays out. And so I've done, in each decade, I've done something different with my life. In my 40s, I became an author, and now in my 50s. As a chief human resources officer, a certain kind of relentlessness. But here's the thing that I learned that I didn't fully understand, that my life experiences had prepared me for a lot of different things. And I think that's true for all of us, that that every experience is a learning, actually, even if it might not feel that way in the moment. Every disappointment, every setback is really a learning that informs and guides and advises us on the next stage of our life, in both our personal lives and in our professional lives.
Completely.
That's
Steve,
an amazing story, Steve. That's for the audience for now, and then when we repost it. Can I tell you again, what was the name of the book and the film? So I'd love to share that so people could read your journey.
Yeah, it's the same title, actually. It's
okay.
A Chance in the World is the name of the book. And a quick 30-second story about that, the title, which A Chance in the World is a colloquialism. It's kind of one of those figures of speech. But that is not actually how I came to the title. I came to the title because some years ago, a woman who babysat for me showed me her father's diary entry. And in her father's diary entry, he was aware of the battle that my mother was having with alcoholism and the battle she was having to keep her children. And he said of me at 1.5 years old that I wasn't going to have a chance in the world. And when I saw that diary entry, I actually smiled because in a way it symbolized exactly what I was trying to get all along. And I think what any of us are either trying to find for ourselves or what we're trying to provide to somebody else. And so it's actually more of a life mission as much as anything else. And then the follow-up book to that is The Lighthouse Effect, where I tell the stories of these 10 people that I met along my life journey. All different walks of life, none of them famous or particularly well-known, maybe with one slight exception, and how I came to meet them and the lessons that I took from those meetings with them, which are far more fascinating than my own life story. Amazing, really, really amazing people.
Steve, this is great. And this is why we love doing this, because you just get I think the way we structure it is that you get real conversations and people like yourself could just talk and then before you know it, there's just so much wealth of knowledge and information that's imparted. And I respect you so much for just being so open, because it's hard to do that. And I give kudos to you for being so open about, who you are and what you've been through. It's really amazing. On a lighter note, though, so who played you in the movie?
Yeah, it was a wonderful child actor. His name is Terrell Ransom Jr.
Okay.
Terrell's just, from a different planet. I think elevated form of human species that comes down to visit with us for a while. He was really, really fantastic. The way that I would liken to your life being translated to the big screen is if I took a memory or asked you to just write down a memory, something very significant in your life. Did you have that? We all have that, right? And I said, hey, I just want you to write it down. Just write it down for me. And be as detailed as possible, And then I took that memory that you've written down and I created a movie set from that memory. And then you walked onto that set and your reaction would be a sense of location. So where am I? Am I in the present time or am I back in the memory? That's the effect that it has on you, which was what it was like to walk onto a set, see a younger version of you. It was.
That's so trippy.
And nobody, exactly what it was, Jack. And nobody told me that. Nobody prepared me for that. But I've just been thrilled with as I thought it was. It was your earlier point about being, honest and open. And had I realized and known how important my story was going to be to others who find themselves on similar paths, I would have done it much earlier. I think it's true for any of us. Sometimes the pain and struggles of our past is a present reality for somebody else, and they see in our victory the possibility of their own. And so if you have those victories, you have to share them. Part of what set my life in motion happened 100 years ago when my grandparents, my great-grandparents who were from Ireland, succumbed to another pandemic, the influenza of 1918. And it sent my grandfather, Joe, off into foster care. He went through so you fast forward 100 years later, I was the third generation to be orphaned. This was a cycle, this was a pattern, this was a,
wow.
So now if you looked at, to our earlier point about labels and markers, my grandfather passed away before I met him, the year before. So I was a year too late, always a source of regret. But if you put the two of us side by side, there's not a physical resemblance. And you would say, well, what in the world could those two guys have in common? There are different generations, different races. Like and we have a lot in common, almost identical narratives, just set, 70, 80 years apart.
You're gonna make me cry, Steve. This is not. We got to sign off soon, so I don't want to embarrass myself by doing that. So, okay, hey, on a more, after we talked about this personal, just if you don't mind, I wanted for people who are watching this and will be watching it again when we post it, because with the social recognition, so that's internally, but do you do that externally as well? And I think, do you give financial rewards to people? So for people who are considering maybe purchasing your platform or your systems, just so we understand a little better.
Sure. So it is peer-based recognition. I'll just almost take like a case study or approach to it. And let's say that we're all working on a project together. It goes well. When we recognize each other, it's just not in commendation of language that exists on a platform, and we recognize each other for the work that we do, but we then assign a monetary value to that recognition. Then again, that is peer driven. So companies who work with us will assign a budget, a percentage of their payroll to recognition, and they share that with employees, and they say, here is a pool of money, and it is for you to use to recognize each other. So when we have that recognition moment and we assign a value to it, and then we go redeem that value for whatever we want. And so I have 3 children. My boys have outgrown, they're big fellas, both Division I athletes. I am no longer able to shop at Foot Locker for them because they're size 15 shoes. I have been buying their shoes through recognition moments, Jack, and I order them online.
So you're doing a good job at work so you can afford the clothes.
Thank you. And it's getting expensive, Jack. It's getting expensive. But now because they're playing Division I sports, their teams are, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. But the boys would say, so Dad, and this is literally what they would say. They say, Dad, I need some Workhuman sneakers. I mean, that to them was like, because it was just a process, right? Now, but you extend that out, right? It's a family dinner, right? It's the small things, and you realize, okay, that is a connection point, right? And you realize that it is tying into one's life. And so it's just not the transaction of buying something. It's more about the meaning and value that's associated with it.
Does it also go online though? Do you put it on social media, or just you keep it internal when you do these social recognitions?
We do keep it internal because, and that's subject to how the company, wants to keep those conversations and those interactions. However, that's more about the detail, like about the specific case, but beyond that, you will routinely see, certainly on the intranet that sits within the company, because that is the platform that we create. I mean, I have feeds as our CHRO, and I pull it up every morning, and I see just this, it's like a swirl of recognition moments.
Wow.
There's no way I could see this on a daily basis. There's just no way. All these interactions, all these millions of moments of recognition that are happening. So it really gives me kind of a pressure test here. If I see on a monthly basis declining moments of recognition, that might signal to me maybe people are getting tired and exhausted. We could be taking each other for granted. And it gives you a real sense for what people are experiencing. They will take that though to become part of their employer brand, as well, because back to our earlier point about what are employees wanting to know about prospective employers. What is your commitment to matters of social equity and fairness? What is your commitment to one another? What is your commitment to growth and acceleration of one's careers? I think it's invaluable to say, let me give you evidence, let me give you the behaviors of that, rather than saying these are the things that we aspire to. So right before I jumped on, I got all of our executive assistants together who report up to me. And we were just kind of talking about the start of 2022. And my last message to them was about their career progression within the company. And at least two of the people who were executive assistants last year are no longer executive assistants because they have grown up upwards in the company. And I was citing that for Dana and Lori, were the two people I was talking about, as evidence for everybody else. And so it's one thing to say that, but you got to provide evidence of that. How did that happen? It started with recognition early on. Dana and Lori's capabilities being recognized by their peers and affirmed over and over again. Now, for their managers and for me, I have to be thinking about that just a little bit differently. How long am I going to be able to keep Dana and Lori when their peers know how great they are? They're told how great they are, but they're not getting promoted. They're not getting advanced. They're going to leave me. They're going to leave this company, who they love, by the way. They love the company, love who they work for. So there's the other side of this, making sure that from, you know, a promotion and advancement standpoint, that we're recognizing that with behaviors.
That's amazing. That's great. Can I want to be respectful of your time, Steve, but can I ask you a favor just to run something by you?
Sure.
But so, well, after about 17 episodes, I think we've had ish, we've learned so much from people like yourself that we were thinking maybe there's something that we can give back to the different companies and offer some sort of, whether it's empathy training or some, you know, happiness training to companies. Do you think there's a market for that? Do you think there's a corporate interest if we had some offering in line of kind of what you do for your company and your clients, but a little different, you know, just to help out managers do a better job of empowering their workers and things of that nature? What do you think of that?
Oh, I think that's, it's beyond if you look at it from my lens, approaching me about something like that, I would see it as not as a nice to, which it probably would have been in all candor prior to the pandemic.
Yeah.
Most of my peers that I'm talking to are in a real battle to retrain and attack, to retain and attract talent, a real battle. When a lot of the traditional levers have not worked.
Do you see any other companies that are doing this, what we're thinking of, like going out there and specifically do that, how to attract, retain, you know, how to attract, recruit, retain people, and all the ways to deal with mental health issues, burnout, isolation?
I see a lot of, you know, smaller consultancies, smaller, you know, tackling it, but more from a thought leadership, you know, point of view.
Like a big picture, but not actually giving the, like,
yeah,
here's
I mean,
what you need to do.
Laura's quick comment earlier about a reaction to what we do. And she said, you're talking about the how. It's the how.
Yeah.
Now, there was a time in the evolution of recognition where we were trying to convince you. I don't think we're having to convince people anymore about happiness and wellness, employers specifically. They get it now. They understand. What they do not know is the how do I go about.
How do you get that done?
Yeah, and but their own self-interest, in all candor, is because they're going to see this as a way to attract and retain people, because it is a real battle. If you're not, you know, if you're going to have people in environments where they're not feeling whole, they're not feeling celebrated, they're not happy, and they're dealing with drama and tension, and, you know, they're going to exit, or they'll say, you know, I'll stay home and paint. You know, I'm not going to, and I'll gig my way to, you know, I'll take multiple gigs as a way of sustaining myself financially, but I'm not dealing with all this other stuff over here when I'm taking care of aging parents and trying to figure out how I'm going to, you know, get my kids to school. And they've said no more. Nor do they want to fight about their productiveness and efficiency and their ability to contribute. And management teams in particular are coming around to that reality.
And it sounds like the way you were describing it, because we were thinking, hey, do you do this in an app or platform? But hearing you talk about it, it does feel like you need that one-on-one, that human to human interaction to help these companies and help these leaders and help these managers do a better job of watching over, the folks. Give you an example, Steve. When you mentioned about, we talk about almost like a second-class citizen for remote workers. I don't know if you saw, there's a Society of Human Resource Managers survey, and I'm shocked that they put this through, and that the managers basically said, we forget about the remote workers, and they're kind of annoying. And the workers were saying, hey, we're being overlooked. And this is from, well, obviously, given what you do, you're familiar with the organization. I was like, wow, that's frightening. And, that and all these conversations make us feel, hey, there has to be a better way to give advice to these companies to do better by their employees, kind of like what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, when you're going to have an overwhelming majority of people working in a hybrid way or remotely, I ignoring them is just not an option.
Yeah.
Because that will then further contribute to the Great Resignation. But I do think that you have to really define the routines and structures by which you talk about that. I mean, we have somebody in our company that's all they're focused on, actually, is our remote workforce, because we have a globally remote workforce. Workhuman is co-headquartered in Dublin, Ireland, and in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so, but you have to have that dedicated focus. And it's right down to a meeting case, because we have meetings where there are people physically in a room and people on screen. We've actually modified and shifted our technology so that I think about our executive meetings, for example, that our CEO, Eric Mosley, kicks off. And when he does, he's in a room and there are people in that room, but the majority of the time, because there are just as many people on screen, he is looking right at the camera rather than just talking to people in the room. Because if I'm doing this and I don't ever look at you, then out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
So, I think unpacking exactly the behaviors, what that looks like, and to be mindful and reminders of, that's that new muscle I was talking about earlier. And leaders have to develop a new muscle around managing and including a remote workforce. Very purposeful about it.
Steve, I love everything you've been saying. And what we're going to do is, once we get this up and live and edit it and clean it all up, really want to promote it, because I would love for us to get what you're talking about in front of as many people as possible, because you send such a empowering, powerful message on so many levels. So I deeply appreciate you taking the time and speaking with us and just being so open and candid and nice and wow, I think that's one of the reasons we do this. When people watch and listen to it, they could walk away with so much information. And not to be crass, but then also, hey, they'll subscribe to your services and get some more customers. So that's important. Let's be honest, that's important too. I can edit that last part out though.
Steve, I have to ask, because I did a little bit background reading, and I saw that Mrs. Sykes, I think, was your English teacher who was incredibly instrumental in your life. What high school did you go to? My kids go to Boston College High School. They're Eagles too, but my older ones headed to NYU. But what high school did you go to?
I went to New Bedford High School.
Oh, okay.
Down on the South Coast. My oldest son, Quinn, he is at Boston College.
Oh, he is. Okay.
He went to high school here in Chicago, and he went to BC High's equivalent, which is Loyola Academy. Two Jesuit high schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, two Jesuit high schools. But John Sykes, who you're referring to, John was the high school teacher who took me in when I was 16 years old. I quite literally had no place to go 3 days after Christmas. It was an incredibly desperate phone call to him saying, hey, my social worker said, asking if I could come stay with him for the week between Christmas and New Year's while they tried to find me more permanent placement. Well, they never did. And so I wound up staying my last year of high school with him.
Wow.
And John, who we lost in the very beginning of 2021, John was the embodiment of a lighthouse for me, and in part because he performed one of the most important things that a human lighthouse can do, and it is that he turned my doubts into destinations. Because, to be honest, up until that point in my life, the world had told me, we don't really have a place for you. You just don't quite fit in. And he, in his own inimitable, mischievous way, he loved literature and poetry, rode Harley Davidsons and drank Jack Daniels, and he and I formed this bond that, will always be, he'll always be on the Mount Rushmore of my life. And that's why I dedicated the book to him, and he is the first chapter in the book, and got to tell his story. Because I was always fascinated, like, why did he do that? Like, why did that man put his life on hold, basically, to see this young kid off to college who he barely knew? And there's some lessons in what he did for all of us, and there are.
Amazing.
Wow.
Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing
Yeah. We
that.
got to stop now before we all tear up again. So,
Yeah, I tear up every time I talk about him.
I can imagine. Wow. So thank you so much. I
Thank
appreciate the
you.
time. This was an
Yeah,
amazing.
thank you. I
amazing
enjoyed this just as
conversation.
much. I really did. And let me help you promote it as well through my own,
Definitely,
social
please.
channels. I love the format, by the way. I like the questions. They always get me to thinking as well. So I just want to, however I
That's
can
great.
help.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
just
And we'll take you up
encourage
on it, by the way. We'll definitely take you up
Yeah,
on
no,
that, my
please,
friend.
please do. I mean,
Okay.
I want to encourage you to keep
Excellent.
forward, and one of the ways I can do that is just by promoting it and helping you.
I love that. Thank you so much, man. Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool.
And,
right.
yes, Steve, this has been great to meet you. And I just want to let you know, I also teach an undergrad course called the Psychology of Well-Being. And I took a look at the trailer for your movie, and I'm going to be assigning it to my freshmen, because I think it's important that they see that side, that, people have different experiences. I think it'd be really useful for them. So
All
I
right,
appreciate you telling
Michael,
us
so
about
here's
it.
what we'll do. Here's what we'll do. Open invitation, no obligation. If you want me to join a Zoom call with your class,
Even
Yes.
look at that.
Amazing.
I'll do
Yes.
that.
Yes, you will come.
Wait a minute, but be careful. That happened to me, and we ended up with this podcast. So you might end up being on the podcast here as a regular. So be careful. I don't know how Mike sucks us in, but that happened. So
I'm just gonna say yes, and we'll get you the date that you want. So you get to pick we have
Sounds
25
good.
classes,
Sounds
so
good.
I'll give you the date
I
that you like,
appreciate
and
you.
I'll reach out for that.
That's
Thank you.
awesome.
excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Cool.
Take
Thank you
care.
so much,
Yeah.
Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.